Hello at home. I'm sure many of you, like me, are getting some pretty funny memes and comments from friends and texts. And one of my friends offhandedly say, "Did you see the two women fighting over toilet paper?" And I didn't, so I did a quick Google search thinking that this video would pop up, and little did I know that in fact multiple videos would pop up, and I found videos of women punching each other in the aisles in the United States, Australia, and the UK, and that was just on my first screen. Despite the fact that there's no supply shortage, people are hoarding toilet paper, bottled water, and other items, adding to the general feeling of panic that we're all experiencing and making supermarket shelves look like the chip aisle after the Super Bowl. How did we get to a point where we would throw a fist at a mom in the grocery store? For the answer, I want to share from Lord Jonathan Sacks's recent interview in the magazine Jewish News, where he was discussing his upcoming book, and I wanted to learn about it. And he says, there have been 3 successive waves of causation for the shift to a me society. Number 1 was the social revolution of the 1960s, which was about whatever works for you. Number 2 was the economic revolution of the 1980s, when greed was good and self-interest fueled the economy. And number 3, the latest wave, is the technological revolution, which has put the focus on the self through social media. So we've been very good on individualism, but much less good on collective responsibility. It's all been wonderfully liberating, but at the same time, we're now beginning to count the costs. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. The beauty of liberation, of individual freedom, and our need for collective responsibility. And so let's turn to Torah. The story of our slavery in Egypt and our liberation from bondage is a story that we all know very well. We talk about it every time we gather to pray. We just sang about it with the Micha Mocha. We relive the story every year on Passover. Exodus begins with the Israelites being forced to build cities for a human king who views them as potential threat to his rule, and he treats them accordingly. But it ends in this week's Torah portion with the people engaged in building the Mishkan, our holy traveling sanctuary, in which God, who has redeemed us, can dwell. The book of Exodus ends with this line: "So the cloud of Adonai was over the tabernacle by day, and the fire was in the cloud by night, in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels." So now God's presence would constantly be with the people, something that humanity hadn't experienced since the Garden of Eden. And God's constant presence isn't the only thing that connects the building of the Mishkan to creation. In Genesis, we hear, "And God saw all that God had done, and behold, it was good." In Exodus, Moses saw all the skilled work, and behold, they had done it. In Genesis, the heavens and the earth and all their array were completed. In Exodus, all the work of the tabernacle and the tent of meeting was completed. In Genesis, and God completed all the work that God had done. In Exodus, and Moses completed the work. In Genesis, God blessed. In Exodus, Moses blessed. In Genesis, God sanctifies. In Exodus, we sanctify. There are many more parallels between the two, enough to have a lesson about, but you get the point. The text wants us to see a connection between the creation of the world and the creation of the Mishkan. To put it simply, Genesis begins with God creating the world as a home for us, and Exodus ends with us, the Israelites, creating a home for God. One thing that bothers commentators in the Bereshit story is that God says, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness. Who is this us? The rabbis of the Talmud suggest many things, including that maybe God was conferring with the angels or using the royal we. But when I thought about what I wanted to talk to you about today, I kept thinking about this line, let us make mankind in our image. So I want you to hold on to that for a moment. See, in Egypt, we were stripped of our freedom, our individuality, our ability to have the autonomy of self. We were forced to do mindless, back-breaking, soul-crushing labor. Our children were murdered. And after that kind of abuse, no one would blame any victim for not wanting to keep to themselves, for not only worrying about themselves and their family. But what happens instead? God says, before you worked out of fear, now I invite you to work out of love. Before you worked with no break, now, even if you want to keep working, you are required to break for at least 25 hours. Before you worked for a human king, now you work for the divine King of Kings. Instead of being forced to work, everyone was to just bring gifts of their heart. And as I said, no reader would blame an ancient Hebrew for not wanting to work. But they all wanted to do this holy work. They brought so much in terms of their material goods, their talent and love, that they had to be asked to stop. When instead of being threatened like Pharaoh, the people were invited by Moses, they were able to come together and build perfectly, exquisitely, a home for God, a space for God to be in their midst, a place for God in their community, a place that would be with them, travel with them. By coming together, they created a piece of heaven on earth. So, when God is creating the world and God says, let us make man in our image, in our likeness, when God uses the plural, perhaps it's foreshadowing one of the lessons of the Mishkan, that when we all come together, we can create a bit of Eden ourselves. These are very weird days. Hard days, scary days. And I don't blame people for wanting to make sure that they and their families have enough. But what if instead of hoarding food for ourselves, we offered to do the grocery shopping for relatives and neighbors who are sick or in the at-risk population? What if instead of thinking about me, we pushed ourselves to think about the collective we? Just as the Israelites could not have built the Mishkan without the entire community coming together, we cannot make this quarantine work without all of us working together. Now is not the time to be selfish. Now is not the time to hunker down and think only about me. Now is the time to think about others. Bring your gifts. Help us build our Mishkan. While we as clergy are offering daily prayers and classes, we need gifts from the whole community to make God's presence felt among us. Tracy Spiegelman just this morning went on Facebook Live and taught a challah baking class. If you've been blessed to have previously tried Tracy Spiegelman's challah, you know that is a slice of heaven. Carolina Gerland has already volunteered many hours calling hundreds of our congregants. Our teachers have shown up every day for our students, holding virtual classes, checking in with them. There is so much we can do, so many ways we can give. And I'll share this too, that when I was looking for the clip of women fist fighting over toilet paper, I came upon a story shared by one neighbor about another neighbor. She said, A neighbor of mine, a rather tall guy, was reaching for the last roll of toilet paper on the grocery store shelf when he noticed a little old lady looking up at him. She would have already had that package in her cart, but she was too short to reach it. He smiled at her and put it in her cart. He figured his wife would understand. My sister-in-law left a note for her elderly neighbor who had to completely socially isolate even from his family. So she left a note letting him know that if he needed anything, he should call. He called immediately. The only thing he needed was to say thank you. And so many companies have stepped up as well, either greatly reducing or making their services free. Crisis, yes, can bring out the worst in people, but it can also bring out the best. We have been living in a culture of me, but the Torah asks of us that we create a culture of we. Let's come together, bring our gifts, sacrifice for the greater good, so that we too can build a dwelling place for God, so we, even in our own homes, feel the constant presence of the divine, a slice of Eden. Ken Yehi Ratzon, may this be God's will. Shabbat Shalom.